Welcome back to lab. Today we're going to be talking about the discussion section. So by now we have written a large part of our paper. We've gone over the introduction, which you've written. You did the literature review and you have your hypotheses, so you've put that together, probably editing it now based on feedback from the TAs. We've also gone over the method section, what goes into that, and we've talked a lot about the different methodologies that go into correlational and experimental research. We just talked about the results last time, though we have had a few weeks where we've talked about how to run the analyses that are necessary for that results section. And so now we're on to the last step, which is to write up what does it all mean, so what? So the discussion section comes after the results section, and the purpose is to evaluate or interpret the results. Again, telling why does what we found out matter. The introduction was giving us a premise of why should we be doing this study, the methods telling us how we are doing the study, the results telling us what did we actually find. So the discussion is talking about whether we supported or rejected the original hypothesis we talked about in the introduction. It raises points from the introduction and discusses what we now know that we didn't know in the introduction. It's going to compare against previous studies to say, did we find the same things or did we find something different? And it's also going to note the limitations of the study that might cause problems for interpretation. Maybe there were some threats to validity that are going to impact our ability to interpret or generalize the findings. We're also going to make recommendations for related research, what are future directions we can take, and then draw up a final conclusion about what is the take-home message from the article and from the paper that you have just written. In terms of layout for the discussion, I want to start off by saying there should be no statistics in this section. We are talking about the interpretation of the findings, but all of the statistics were in the results section. That is, the actual hard data was in the results section, the analyses. What you're doing in the discussion is talking about what the findings were, talking about the bigger picture and how whatever statistically significant results you found, what does that actually mean in a broader context? I don't want any numbers here. It should also be at least 5 paragraphs long. This is one of the longer sections of an article. Your introduction was about 5 or 6 paragraphs long as well. This should match it in about the size and scope. In this, you're going to include your hypothesis and the status. So was it rejected or not? You're going to compare to the past research, talk about the implications and limitations, that future directions, and the general conclusion, as I stated before. So here is a good blueprint outline for writing your discussion section, and you want to make sure you're hitting each one of these. And we're going to go through each of these bullet points, each of these numerals, in a little bit more depth. So first we'll start with the restate purpose and the hypothesis. This is a pretty quick step. All you're going to do in this is open up with what was my original hypothesis. That's it. So you might have the example, this study sought to investigate the relationship between attachment security and self-esteem among college students, and we hypothesized that secure attachment would be positively correlated with self-esteem. There it is. You spoke about the hypothesis and you said exactly what the hypothesis would be. It's clear what the variables are and it's clear what is anticipated. You could also say this study also examined age differences in attachment security. Students were expected to report more positive attachment security as they increased in age. Again, very clear what the variables were and very clear what the researcher thought was going to be the relationship between the variables that are described. You want to open with that. It should be clear from the start of the discussion what the variables were and what you thought was going to happen. Once you have established what you thought was going to happen, you should say whether that did happen. Provide a brief summary of the results section, what was found, by stating if the hypothesis was supported or not supported. You don't have to get into using terminology like null hypothesis and rejecting the null hypothesis. You just need to say whether we found support for our hypothesis. You also want to make sure you don't use stats, but you still describe what the statistics meant. So you could say the current findings support or didn't support the hypothesis, and similar with previous work the current study found, or contrary to prior literature the results of the study indicated. Whatever it is, you want to convey whether or not your hypothesis worked and what your major finding was from that results section. You also in this paragraph can draw a brief inference about the results. So something like, these results support the idea that changing social norms may be an effective way of increasing environmental behavior among college students. So that is a very clear, big picture implication of a finding. Or these results do not provide support for the idea that changing social norms is an effective way of increasing environmental behavior among college students. So maybe if you had a null result, that could be the interpretation. That could be the inference about the result. Again, you don't have to go into major detail here. You just need to convey the major take-home effect that you found from your results. No statistics, just the interpretation of those results. After you've done the restating and telling just was it supported, what did it mean in response to your hypothesis, you then want to go on to incorporating past research, which is talking about what was found before and how does your project match previous research or differ from those previous research. What does it mean that it followed exactly what you thought the hypothesis would be versus what does it mean if it didn't? So in this section, you are briefly summarizing the most important points that you're taking from your introduction section. Remember that your introduction was a big logic where you were presenting things that had been done before, research that had been conducted, ways that variables were related previously, and you are trying to make some big argument about what you think will happen based on what you already know is the relationship between other variables. So in your discussion, you are taking those points and discussing whether or not you found valid and you found recreation of those points. A way to get started in this incorporate past research section is with, as mentioned in the introduction, or it's interesting to consider the results of the current study in the context of the theory, insert study, of previous work in this field which suggests ... So there's a very long, verbose way of introducing, hey, I have something interesting here that matches or doesn't match something that's been done before, or a theory, a big picture idea that we are investigating. You might also say the results of the current study are broadly consistent with prior studies examining ... So again, finding some segue, a very quick segue into discussing past research related to your own research. You also want to make sure you are hitting on how do your findings match or not match, this compare and contrast. You probably have a lot of experience doing compare and contrast essays from high school or other courses in college. That is essential for the discussion section. You want to think about how might the things you have focused on, the way you measured your variables or the way you cared about different kinds of variables, change or be different in your introduction and how that might frame your results. You also want to talk about how your results imply certain things that you focused on in your introduction and maybe don't imply others. And is there any inconsistency between your work and what other people have done? If you researched and had a hypothesis that you think you had really good logic for and then you didn't find support for that, well, why is that? How was your finding different? And if you did find support, what makes you think that there's a reason for you have founding this? Or what does it mean that you found more support for the same theory that you had written about in your introduction? You also want to make sure you mention other studies throughout this and include those proper citations. Just like your introduction, not everything is your idea. You are relating to the bigger scientific community in everything that you write, and you want to give credit where credit is due. So you're going to have a lot of in-text citations in this section, just like in your introduction. You want to make sure they're in APA format. Please make sure to avoid quoting word for word. I know there was some confusion about that in the introduction. No word for word, not even citing your own introduction section and quoting word for word. You should always be summarizing the ideas. So as an example, you might say, as mentioned in the introduction, Green and Campbell, 2001, found that attachment security was related to curiosity and exploration interests. There, we have reestablished something from the introduction that was interesting, and we're bringing it back to the discussion to repeat our conversation about why that was a relationship and why we think that relationship would happen again, and how our findings supported or didn't support whatever Green and Campbell discussed. You might also say the results of the current study replicate prior findings that an incremental theory of intelligence predicts greater perseverance on tasks. And again, cite the person with that in-text citation from Dweck and Leggett, 1988. Again, here you are bringing back research that you discuss in your introduction so that you can talk about it and talk about the implications related to your own findings and your own logic. As an example, here's an actual discussion section. You can see that it starts off with a discussion of the variables, the aggression and alcohol use, and by the end, they have made sure to clarify that they are testing a hypothesis that aggression relates to greater alcohol consumption through a shared neural basis in reward circuitry activity during aggression. Okay, that is a very clear hypothesis that they've stated, and it's clear what their variables are. The authors then go into the next step of saying, what did they actually find? Was there any support for their research? So they say, we observed that activity in the ventral striatum during retaliatory aggressive acts was associated with greater regression. This finding supports aggression's fundamental rewarding nature and neural basis in the brain reward circuitry. So here it is very clear that they found support for what they were looking for, and they are relating it to past research. They're saying that they also had this correlational evidence supports the reciprocal nature of the link between perceived alcohol consumption and aggression. That is tying back into a theory that was promoted by Huang et al. In 2001 that they probably talked a lot about in their introduction and are now bringing back here to remind the reader about the bigger theory and about how their findings help to support that theory. And you should be doing the same thing. Something to note is that many times researchers will put both this point 1 and point 2 kind of together in the same opening paragraph. You can separate it into two separate paragraphs if you want, where you just very clearly restate your purpose and hypothesis, and then your second paragraph talks about the past research and the theories. But a lot of writers will want to kind of mix them together if it works better for their writing style. You can decide what you want, but we will be evaluating, looking for, is there a clear purpose? Is there a clear hypothesis? Is there clear incorporation of past research and discussion of whether your hypotheses were supported? If we don't see all of those elements, you're going to get knocked because those are essential elements, but how you choose your own voice to convey them is up to you. But after you've done both of those, you then go on to the implications of this. What was meaningful about your research? What was expected, and why did that happen? Can you infer any kind of causality or directional relationship between your variables, and what are the possible interpretations there? So in this section, you're discussing how your study contributes broadly to the scientific literature. The other two paragraphs you wrote so far were more overview, big picture, what theories are we looking at, how did the big picture finding apply, but now we're getting more into the gritty and talking about taking your results and kind of interpreting something about humanity and going bigger with it. So did your study add something that hadn't been studied previously? Or is there a different population or group that you looked at, or a different way that you measured the variable? Did this study help resolve any problem that was addressed in your introduction and in previous literature? Was there something missing that we wish we had known and you helped to answer that? Did you use, again, different measures that maybe hadn't been done before, and that might solve our misunderstanding or misalignment between two researchers who had found different support for the same theory? And have you replicated any of the prior research? If you did you use any different methods? If you didn't and you use the same methods, that's also great. And then just how did your study build upon this previous work? And you want to make sure that for all of this, you are citing the other papers and making sure you're giving credit there and connecting your stuff to the broader research. You also want to go over the real-world implications or applications of your findings. Can they be used in any kind of scenario like school or government or health policy? Just any way that there's going to be the real-world applications. And then maybe it could be applied for an intervention, or people can use it in their day-to-day actions. How is it going to change human day-to-day by knowing about this finding? Why would you go to your friend and tell them you found this interesting thing, and then they go to you and say, so what? mean, that's really what you're doing here. You're saying, so what? What is the implication? Why did we go through all of this work to find this out? And what does finding it out actually mean for us? The next section after this implications is to talk about the shortcomings. Because of course, no paper that we do is perfect. Just a note, sample size is a weak argument for shortcomings. I don't really want to see that. We have a sample that's large enough for our analyses, so you have to be a little bit more clever than that. It's good to remember that even if we find support for our hypotheses and our results come out just the way they want, there's always possible other ways to interpret. There's always going to be some study limitations. And so you need to have 3 of these, and you're going to be marked for each one that you do, because there are innumerable. That's basically what this course is about, is what are all the ways that we design our experiments and our correlational study and our descriptive statistics in ways that are trying to limit the limitations, but they still exist. There's still issues of validity and reliability that we should always be looking at and that we can't get perfect. You need to talk about that here. So you should think about the design and procedure of the study and try to think about, how could it have been done differently? Or if we had done it differently, how could that have come up with different findings? Or how did the way we design it maybe help to support certain findings? Or what are some design confounds that may have popped up that we didn't know about? You can talk about the way variables are measured, so the actual measurement of the scales and behavior. You can talk about the number of variables. You can talk about the test and retest if there was any, and then how generalizable are the findings, so that external validity there. You want to be going through this entire section considering everything that we have talked about in this course regarding validity. And you don't have to talk about it at that length. And in fact, sometimes you don't even have to use the jargon that we've talked about, like construct validity doesn't necessarily need to show up in your discussion, but those concepts should. So it should be clear that you are thinking about how there's always different interpretations. No study is perfect, and you need to address that in ways here. Now, you don't want to belittle your paper and say, oh, we can't interpret any of this. It's just a terrible study. It doesn't mean anything. You instead want to say, what are alternate explanations and why? Why might those alternate explanations exist? What are some limitations to our interpretation? I'm not saying you're wrong, and you don't want to say that you're wrong. You just say there's always the potential, and this is why. Finally, you want to go into the future research, which you've just addressed why your study isn't perfect and why there's other alternative explanations. So maybe how can we do it differently in the future? What are future researchers going to be looking at and interested in after they've learned from your study? In this section, you're going to discuss what other people should do based on your findings, not just coming up with a random idea for the future of, oh, this would be a cool study, but your findings have just informed the reader in some way about something. What are they going to want to do next? For instance, you could suggest a variety of next steps that could build upon the current study, such as what is the takeaway from this study and how could you build on those takeaways? What is something unknown about the relationship still between these variables? What didn't you answer and what could be slightly tweaked to be able to answer that? You also want to talk about other variables in relation to the one you studied that might open up the door for a better understanding of the variables and their relationship to many things in our world, and to help understand individuals in relation to that variable. And you want to talk about specifically which ones and why. Were there any other studies in your introduction that included variables that you found important that you just didn't study, but you think other people might find interesting? You can also talk about conducting experiments to determine cause and effect relationships. This is if you did a correlational study, which, this is a survey, so it has a lot of correlational opportunity in it. But if there was going to be some kind of harder experimental methodology that was going to be used to help determine that cause and effect, what would that study look like? And why would we do that study? Maybe there could be different kinds of analyses or methods or samples that were used in all of these. Again, don't talk about the sample size per se, because we've talked a little bit about power and effect size. That's a little bit boring of a reason. Instead, talk about what if we had done it in a different population, or if we had measured using a different methodology. Those are the kinds of things that are interesting. But with all this, it's not just enough to say, oh, hey, why don't we use a different method, or why don't we use a different sample? I mean, you could come out and say, hey, why didn't we during our experiment make everybody wear clown shoes? Or why didn't we measure every third person, who has the name Mark? Like, none of that would really necessarily matter, right? Instead, you want to talk about other samples and why they might be interesting. Why would studying a different gender demographic or a different race demographic be interesting? Why would using maybe there's 3 measures out there, different kinds of methodologies. Why would that measure be unique? What is it about the reliability of a different scale that might cause different findings or similar findings that you want to check? There should always be not only here's an idea, but why is that idea interesting? What might we find different if we follow through on that idea? Or what might we find the same and find more support for our ideas if we used this different methodology? So the future directions part is really important to give ideas of what to do, but we don't want to leave people just thinking, oh, wow, there were shortcomings and they're saying we should do all this other stuff. You want to remind the reader of why your study was actually still a good one and we had some kind of take-home interesting message. It was worth reading. And this is that big picture general conclusion paragraph. Now, you don't want to be grandiose and talk about just how amazing your article was and how it answered everything we could ever want to know. That's just not true, and readers will know it. But you do want to wrap up your article, wrap up the purpose and the findings. So in this last short paragraph, it only needs to be a few sentences, you want to give the reader a take-home message in terms of your research. How do your findings fit into a big picture in the field of research that you've talked about? What's the main takeaway message and where should it go in the future? Again, just briefly reminding them of how do they want to leave this article? What do they want to have felt? What do they want to take home to talk to their friends about? In sum, you are generalizing your general conclusion that is going to wrap up your paper. I already said it once, but don't be grandiose. We know that your study was not complicated or that detailed. It was just a simple survey. So be realistic, but still try to make it clear why your study was a good one and what people want, what they should take home from it. In the end, the discussion should have conveyed a couple of things. The first is what has been learned so far. Remember, there's the introduction, which told all about what you think, but you want to add in your results. And then what are the broader importance of your findings? How do we take this information and go beyond this study to talk about human nature, society, different ways of living day to day? How are these findings useful? You want to make sure it's clear where we should go next, and you want to convey what we still have left to do, what future researchers should investigate. And then, of course, try to end with some kind of clear conclusion. That is just if somebody read your article, what is the one thing they could go and talk to their friends about and say, here's my little one-liner about that paper. You should always remember that the research report is part of a logical flow. It's set up the way it is for a reason. You always start off with the statement of the problem. What do we not know? What do we want to know about? You conceptualize that problem through incorporating other people's research and developing the theory and then coming up with a hypothesis about how you think the variables are related in your current study. You talk about how you researched the problem to see if you could find support for a hypothesis. You talk about how the data was analyzed. You do a lot of that in your methods and results section, depending on which aspect of it you're talking about, whether it's your measures or the actual analytic processes. In your results section, you give all the data to show what the findings were. And then your discussion section's whole point is talking about how the findings should be interpreted and used outside of this research. You're going from big picture in the introduction to very small in your methods. You're funneling down to your method and your results, which are very specific about your study. And then the discussion is pulling back out and taking from the very narrow look at your research and what you did to the bigger picture. Taken as a whole, your entire paper should tell a story about an interesting scientific finding that you have performed here. The discussion is your way to wrap up that story, and so you can be as creative and interesting and use your own voice, talk about it thoughtfully as you can, so that by the time the person gets to the end, they've said, wow, I just learned something about this topic. So that was our last section that we're talking about in lab. So you're going to have your lab assignment number 6 that's due next Monday. This is a discussion worksheet. The way it works, it's going to have a lot of bullet points that you are going to have to fill out to describe the stuff that we just talked about. What are the implications? Was your hypothesis supported or not? You should be able to answer all of the questions in the discussion worksheet. And if you are struggling to, well, that's a good time for you to seek feedback. You're also next week going to review all of the sections again. Just make sure you're clear. It's going to be a very short lab. And then after that, you're on your own. Now I've told you all about how to write a paper. And so you should be reaching out to your TAs if you're struggling with any of the sections, making sure that you know your final paper is due not during finals week of the semester, but instead on the 21st of April. Make sure that you are incorporating feedback from your TAs. And again, anytime you are confused, reach out to your TAs and seek help. They are the ones who are going to be evaluating your final report and your final paper, so they are the ones to go to. That's it. Good luck and see you again.